I find it amazing that currently the Supreme Court is taking the case about the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship at a time when we're talking about Reconstruction and that 14th Amendment came to life. But I think what you need to know about Reconstruction, really, if you think about it, is it was a failure in many ways, but it did have some successes that gives us the foundation blocks that can be built on even today. Now, the time period we're talking about is 1865, right after the Civil War, into 1877, which will end with the crisis of 1877. Some of the good things you're going to need to know. You're going to need to know about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. I do that in a way where it's ACV. 13th, A, abolishes slavery. C is the next one. So the 14th Amendment is about citizenship. And then 15th is V, which is for voting rights and securing those. And who are they securing it for? But is for the formerly enslaved that are now citizens of the United States. That's approximately 4 million people in the South. However, there are three different plans that people were kind of thinking about. First was Lincoln and his 10% plan, which was prior to him being unalived. There was President Johnson. He was a Southern Democrat that was definitely open to bringing the South in under much less constraints. And then there's the radical Republicans who wanted to stick it to the South and make sure that it never happened again. But the question is really, were the radical Republicans wrong? I even had students that were really questioning the plans that Lincoln was putting together. If we started with the 10% plan, 10% of the voters gave their loyalty back to the Union and they could come back in. It was a little more with the open arms, just like his inaugural speech in 1865, charity towards all, malice towards none, as far as bringing back in the southern states. But Johnson, when he came in, he wanted to give civilian control of the South. I mean, how could that possibly be a bad idea? This is where black codes were created in these southern states to kind of circumvent the 13th Amendment. So the radical Republicans knew this was going to be a problem, so they decided they wanted to go into and use the military to control the South with their 5 military districts under the Reconstruction Acts. And they had numbers in the Congress, so even if Johnson wanted to veto any type of legislation, they couldn't, because the Congress could override the veto with their 2/3 majority. They knew voting was important, all right, especially to solidify Republican support in the South, so they wanted the voting rights to be in the hands of the newly freed and formerly enslaved. So as the South was being rebuilt, it ends up, and just like always, when there's a little too much power on one side, like the Republicans had, it breeds corruption. And sure enough, there was a lot of corruption that was going on as they were rebuilding the South, which caused a little bit of a split between the radical Republicans and kind of the normal, more liberal Republicans. You had the rise of violence in the South, all right, which is why the military was there. In fact, the creation of the Department of Justice was done by Ulysses S. Grant because of the situation, the creation, and the chaos that was being committed by the KKK, which was started with former Confederate soldiers, and they were specifically targeting violent actions towards Republicans, whether you were white or black. People grew tired over time of the radical Republicans' ideas, things like the Freedmen's Bureau, which was really the first government program that was put together to help with schooling and to help with the poverty situation of the formerly enslaved. But the South wanted redemption, hence the term redeemers, which is going to come up. And this was happening throughout the South. This was the growing militias of the white leagues were starting to take control of areas. And really the idea was to put those former Confederates back into power in these Southern governments, which leads us to the 1876 election. The election of 1876 was Samuel Tilden. He was from New York, and then you had Rutherford B. Hayes from Ohio. And so this was a hard-fought battle in which Tilden won the popular vote, but Hayes was ahead in the Electoral College. And here's where the problem comes in. There are 3 southern states that are withholding their votes and delaying the process because they do not want a Republican president in there, which was Governor Rutherford B. Hayes. So South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. Yeah. I mean, those guys are always in trouble. Now, they were saying that there was election fraud, but it was not really fraud. It was a delay tactic that was being used, amongst others, to not certify the election, because here's the fear. If they don't certify the election and we don't have a candidate that got enough electoral college votes, what happens on Inauguration Day in early March? That was too much for the country to handle. So in early 1877, in the Wormley House, in a smoke-filled back room, I love those smoke-filled back rooms, right? That's when all the dirty deals are done. So Republicans and Democrats came to a conclusion that they would certify the election in those 3 states and make Rutherford B. Hayes the president of the United States from the election of 1876. Now, the Democrats, what did they get out of it? They had the Northern Army, the Union Army, removed and out of the districts after the election, in which they would be able to then reinstate the governments that they desired in the South. The idea is and hence the term redeemers, they wanted to redeem the South from Negro rule, and that's why they were pushing for that. So the positives in all of this situation was the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, in which they were able to solidify what is going to be the civil rights movement of the 20th century. The negative side and the failure of Reconstruction is it did nothing to curtail the violence in the South of Northern whites against the formerly enslaved. And that continued to fester and create so much tension. And it really put the country in a position behind the times, and it was hard for it to move on because it led to further, black codes, which led to the Jim Crow laws of the South, Plessy versus Ferguson, the idea of segregation in the South, and it was never going to be separate but equal. It was never going to be equal, and that played out over time. So Reconstruction, we had a good side, we had a bad side, but it had a huge, huge effect going into the 20th century, and you want to keep that in mind because that's kind of that pivot point that you want to remember. And frankly, even like I said, it's coming up today with the 14th Amendment on who is a citizen of the United States and who isn't. And the Supreme Court's probably going to decide here probably in very, very soon. They've agreed to hear the case. So now you know your freaking history.